My name is Michael Joseph, and I love liberty. But no one else seems to. Why not? I ambushed a Nazi, a communist, and a Caliphist on Omegle to find out. Politically, this is all I care about. But I swear, everyone else, no one cares about it at all. So I'm just trying to find why not, you know?
Well, probably because libertarianism is cringe and authoritarianism is epic.
Oh, so you're an authoritarian?
Yeah, absolutely.
Whoa, okay. So what's so good about that?
Because people are retarded and shouldn't have the right to do whatever they want because they usually fuck it up if they do.
But aren't those people that are in charge? They're also retards, right?
No, it's there's a small percent of the human population that's actually intelligent and has the right willpower to lead, and they should be in charge, and the people should not be.
Okay, who are those people then?
I don't know.
Who? Give me an example of an actual person you think fits in that category.
Living or dead?
Living. Let's go with living.
Okay, living. Hang on. Fuck, I can't think of the name right now. The leader of Hungary.
I don't know, some guy. He's so are you alt-right or fascist or anything like that?
Well, alt-right's retarded. They're dumb Wignat.
Okay.
Wignats, so.
So are you further right than alt-right?
I'm more optical and family-friendly version of the alt-right.
Okay. Is that cover so that you can spring out at the end and get
Yes.
everybody, or is it more
Yeah, I pop out of it like a jacket.
Okay. And then now, is this something you really believe, or you just love believing because everyone else hates it so much?
No, I genuinely believe in this. I think dictatorship is probably the way to do things.
Well, I mean, look, democracy isn't a great way to do things, right? So I'm not pro-democracy, don't get me wrong. But dictatorship, I mean, what happens if you get the wrong guy?
Well, you just have to have a system set up to get the right dictator.
Okay, but what system is that?
I don't know. I'd probably look at how the Roman Empire did it, honestly.
But then the Roman Empire, would you have liked to live in those times?
Yeah, that would have been pretty epic.
Okay, so, but why not then just, why not go with all your buddies just into the middle of a big field and fucking do it? Just whoever's strongest just becomes the leader, and then it's just tyranny from then on. And you could totally have that, probably in the woods with 40 guys.
Can I be Hadrian?
Can you be Adrian?
Hadrian.
Hadrian?
Yeah, he killed 500,000 Jews.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. Now, it's hard. Oh, wow. The Nazi stopped talking to me. Can you believe this? Hey, how's it going? Hi. Oh, a gas mask. That's pretty cool. I'm trying to talk about liberty today. Are you interested in that?
I don't think you'll like me very much.
You're sorry?
I said I don't think you'll like me very much.
Oh, listen, I have no particular problem with just about anybody.
What does that mean to you?
Communism? Oh, that's fine. I mean, hey, why communism?
Why communism?
Yeah.
I think that production should go towards the betterment of people, not for the sake of profit.
Okay, but what if communism doesn't do that?
I mean, it does.
No, but what if it didn't? Is it that you want that goal and you think communism is best to get there, or do you want communism and that goal is something you use to to sell communism? Which one comes first? Which is the commitment stronger to?
Well, socialism is the journey towards communism.
Sure.
The mechanism.
Yeah, but then you're kind of for liberty too. You just think socialism gets there. Okay, so
I support liberty.
There's common ground, right? I'm a little worried about socialism on that front. You know what I mean? And in particular, the way it's described when we get there is, not that bad. But the path there doesn't seem particularly good. In the short term, it seems like liberty kind of gets thrown to the wayside.
I mean, you have to sacrifice some freedoms, right?
But do you? Do we?
I think so, yeah.
But what if we didn't have to? Would that be better?
I think the American experiment is showing that you kind of do have to sacrifice some freedoms.
But the American experiment has been shit since the very beginning. You got a whole bunch of the super privileged guys who win the war. They have some good ideas, fine. Right away, all the constitutional problems, all the tyranny or whatever, like every president is only, all their sayings that people talk about are when they're out of office. Because you can't take anything when they're in office, they're complete hypocrites. So if you can't look at America and say, oh, no, liberty doesn't work because of America.
Well, the people who, invented this concept of liberty were living under kings and queens,
Sure. Yeah.
So you can't really take their word for it either.
Well, okay, so what's the right concept of liberty?
Well, I mean, our lives are sort of built around labor, I would imagine. You would agree. Most of what we do is work.
Yeah, most people, sure.
So I would say the emancipation of your labor is the most important thing.
Yeah, sure.
That's the most important liberty to me.
Yeah, I think that's, so we agree there, right? It's just, I think things like taxation or whatever, those are taxes on your work, right? So.
I agree, taxation is theft.
Taxation, hey, listen, taxation is theft. You and I are best friends, what are you kidding? So
yeah,
we disagree
okay, but then would you agree that the
communism.
surplus value that your boss takes from your labor is also theft?
There's no surplus value though. Surplus
There
value
is.
isn't real.
What do you mean it's not real?
Surplus value isn't real. Right? It's not true.
Okay, well then, with that argument, you can just say, okay, taxation is not theft because the federal government gives the currency that you use value, and they own it and give it to you. So technically, it's not theft because, they created it.
No, I mean, well, there's a sense, but then you have to say the federal government owns everybody, right? So it's that might be practically true, in the sense that we're all percentage slaves, right? Sure, as a reality, that's the case of how we live, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And the whole the federal government, they have no legitimate ownership, so they can't have legitimate.
I mean, they do have legitimate ownership because they're the ones with the state apparatus and the weapons.
Sure.
That is how legitimacy is founded.
Well, so I think legitimacy comes from the rights of the situation. For instance, you think it's not right to have surplus value taken from the person. So it doesn't matter whether that just is what's happening. That doesn't make it legitimate. What would be the legitimate situation is when there's no surplus value to you.
I would say that the surplus value of your labor should go into replenishing the labor,
Yeah.
insurance for any issues that might occur,
Yeah.
and things of that nature, whereas they shouldn't go into the boss's pocket.
But there's not necessarily any surplus value, right? Because for one, you can hire a bunch of workers and take a loss, right? So there might actually be, not only is there no surplus value, there's no value of any kind. The boss just takes a loss. That's
okay,
possible.
but then there's no surplus. If there's no surplus, then that's different.
Right, but the thing is, there's not always surplus value. And I think in the situations where you're identifying surplus value, that value is the value that the owner creates with their decisions, right? Because their decisions, they can make very bad decisions and lose money, or very good decisions and make money. But the worker is kind of actually, they actually have a relatively steady wage, even amongst different employers, because they're always contributing kind of the same amount of value. And it's up to the owners to what are they creatively going to do with this team of people?
Well, the vast majority of people aren't paid the value of the labor. The vast majority of people are paid whatever federal or state wage is the lowest, because people have to work. Because there's no freedom there. If you don't work, you die.
No, but I think it's 1 or 2% of people are on minimum wage, right?
Yeah, but it grows from that. And if you're telling me if they got rid of federal minimum wages or state wages, you're telling me everyone's average wage wouldn't plummet massively?
No, the average wage wouldn't, but there'd be a few people. I think there's a few people on the margin who are better off because of minimum wage. But the problem with minimum wage is, even if you think there's 100% of society and it's good for 17 to 15 percentile, but what about below 15? What if you're not skilled enough to produce the minimum wage? I mean, it's shitty for those guys, homeless people, or people who are just really have no skills at all, right? Maybe they've been through bad life situations, whatever. The minimum wage can make those people unemployable.
Okay, but I think the state should provide for those people. So I guess that's where we disagree.
Yeah, that's where we disagree. You know what? It's been amazing talking to you. You thought we would hate each other, but I love you.
I mean, everyone has the same end goal. If you're, caring human beings, how you get there, that's the difference, right?
Absolutely.
I want people to be happy and free. I just think the best way to do that is through the state apparatus, and yours is probably through individual lines.
Absolutely. And you have a cool gas mask too. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Don't die of corona.
Hi there. How are you doing?
I'm great. What about yourself, sir?
I am trying to talk today about liberty. What do you want to talk about?
Anything rather than the US, because that's not my field of expertise. I'm from Turkey, living in Germany.
Oh, okay, cool.
But yeah, I mean, I'm able to talk about anything you want to talk. I have certain fields where I'm more knowledgeable, less knowledgeable.
Sure.
But I can go around a lot of topics, I guess.
Okay, so how do you feel about, I'm a libertarian, right? So for me, freedom, basically everything. What about you? Where do you stand on liberty?
So when you say freedom, you mean things like freedom of expression, freedom of thought, right? So these
freedom of everything.
Freedom of everything, including certain aspects where the government shouldn't interfere in life, correct?
Absolutely, but not just that. No government.
No government at all.
Yeah.
So I think in an idealistic world, right, in a utopia.
Yeah.
Let's imagine a utopia. Right?
Sure.
Where there's everything going perfectly, right? I think a society where something like that could function, hypothetically speaking, right, is a society where we don't need any government because people know what they need to do and know what they cannot do, right?
Yeah.
And how people just put in as much in the system and the collective as much as they can and just take as much as they need. Okay?
Yeah.
So again, that concept of communism, for example, right? However, I think that in the real world, you're not able to apply that based on the fact that we've seen communist systems, right?
Sure.
We've seen that people tend, or it's easier to convince people to work for the individual will, and it's much harder to convince people to work for the good of a community or a collective, right? That is much harder to convince people for that.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to no government, again, if people wouldn't do stupid stuff, if people wouldn't commit crimes, for example, let's take a authority like the judicial system as an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
as something that has authority. In an ideal world, we wouldn't need something like that because people do not commit crimes. In an ideal world, in a utopia, right? However, because people tend to do stuff like that, I think it is important to have an authority in certain aspects.
Sure.
I'm
okay with everything you're saying, though. So far, I am totally agree.
When it comes to freedom of expression and freedom of thought, right? I think that, so based on the fact that I've lived most of my life in Germany, right? I think that the system that Germany is implementing when it comes to democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom of gatherings is a system that is fairly good based on the fact that the sense behind it is you can say whatever you think and you can say whatever you want to the extent as to you can not say stuff, or you can, the saying goes, your personal freedom of expression, your personal freedom goes as far to the point as where you start to interfere with someone else's personal freedom of expression or freedom of thought.
Yep.
So being an example, right, in Germany, there's rather strict hate crime laws. So when I would build up a stance in my city center saying, well, black people are inferior and white people are supreme race, taking that as an example. Okay? If I would exclaim something like that in public and trying to promote that, I would very quickly get fined for a hate crime in Germany, 100%. So I think that we need to have a system where you're able to say whatever you want to say, as long as it doesn't go against our democratic values when we live in a democracy, right?
Totally. I'm not big on democracy, to be honest, but what you were saying about communism, I'm not a communist either, right? I genuinely believe that if people are left to their own devices and they organize voluntarily, I think the right structures and systems and authorities kind of come from the bottom up. And a lot of that has to do with like who we decide to associate with, the incentives that are naturally in place. And I think just because we need some authorities doesn't mean we need monopoly force authorities. Do you know what I mean? I think that there's ways to create authority that's legitimate, that people recognize, that they voluntarily cede to, and that they go to in times of crisis, without a government the way that we construct them right now.
Okay, so I would argue for the factor, right? I think that again sounds like a perfect, a perfect system, a perfect society, right? But again, we live in a world where there are people who don't have that sense, so they don't say, okay, it would be ideal if we would all get along and we would all make a certain amount of money.
Yeah.
The best thing would be if I would make the most money, or
Sure.
if I would have the most power. So the thought of most people, and that is the point where I'm trying to get at, is that people tend to strive for a system or a standard in which the individual, being themselves, has the most freedom, the most power, and the most money.
Yeah.
Which is very counterproductive to a system where we would say, okay, we don't need any authorities because people are just going to get along and do good things. Because it's been proven time and time again that people don't do that, and
Sure.
people work for the individual good.
But the thing is, like the Adam Smith insight, that when the individual works for their own good, they often produce common good. I think that that's a real thing. And for instance, when I think about my system, I'm recognizing that people are corrupt and flawed. And I still think that the system would be better. It wouldn't be perfect. There would be conflict. But there's two problems. One is that I don't know that you can impose morality on people and have it turn out well. But secondly, I actually don't think that either that the fact that there are bad people means that we need to create this kind of superpower, right, in the center of our society, and then give it to a person who very well may be bad. Especially, especially when you think about, like, you and I are sitting here, I have my own life, I got my kids, I got my whatever, I'm just kind of minding my own business. I actually don't have an ambition to power. But the people who do, they're the ones who become the leaders, and I'm not so sure that the people who have the ambition to power are always from the best part of the pool.
Oh no, definitely not. I think when we talk about Western democracies in general, right? Let's just take Western democracy in general, like, so a big part of Europe, right? Western Europe, a big part of North America, Australia, New Zealand. So the Western world as we recognize it, right? When we look at the Western world, it's been proven time and time again that there are fairly capable leaders in these countries, but that your ambitions, sadly, at some point, so if you have good ambitions, if you're trying to create something good, right, start or work for the good of a people group, right, if that system was pliable, so if only that was going to happen, right, if we would only get people in our higher ups who are working for the individual, for the good of all people, and who don't want to get any personal wealth out of it, that would be an ideal system again. But as I was saying, in Western democracies, it's often the case that we've seen people who tend to have an incredible amount of money for certain reasons. So being millionaires, billionaires, right? Yeah. And using that amount of money and using their power, which is associated with wealth, to influence politics. Yeah, absolutely. An example in the U.S. would be how you can give millions and millions of dollars to a campaign for a president, right, or for a presidential candidate. You can give that candidate as a supporter millions and millions of U.S. dollars to exercise your constitutional right for democracy. So I think that something like that is flawed, because if we have a case of money and economic wealth being a determined factor in democracy, I think that would be that is the situation we're currently living in, especially in the Western world. And I think that is a very flawed system.
Sure. But what if we had only one rule, and the rule was you can't do anything to someone without their consent? right? Because the problem is in the current, what you're describing is a real problem. Like these guys have a ton of money and they use it to influence politics. But if politics wasn't there, they can't use their money for evil. You know,
I would 100% agree, but the way that politics has evolved, right, that society in general has evolved throughout the centuries and decades of history, right, has always advocated, first of all, for security. So if we look at the roots of how society came around in the ancient times, right, and in German it means how's it called again? The area. Mesopotamian, which is in Mesopotamia, so the area in current-day Iraq, between the Tigris, right, in the middle of the Tigris, that's where a lot of early civilizations came around. And so the deciding factor in building up society was food insecurity, because people started to, develop crops, right, plant crops, and started to amass more food, and more people started to come to these areas because of the food. And one person took control of the food through forceful means at times, right? And more people came to the area because they kept growing more food, and then they built up cities, and you had architecture, or you had people building more houses because more people came to get food, and you had a lot of things developing because of these two factors, security and food. And that is how every society that is what society was brought out to be. So that's how society came into existence. And no matter which political ideology or which political direction you follow, the founding principle of each society is the same, right? So people tend to look for leaders who are able to protect them, and who are able to feed them. It's the same how in ancient Rome, for example, in German there's a saying Brot und Spiele, which means bread and games, because the Romans were willing to give up their personal freedom of speech and thought on the conditions that A, they had bread, so A, they were well supplied, had food, and B, had games, so were well entertained and had a fairly good life. I think that process, or that the idea of a lot of humans being that we are not necessarily so much in favor of democracy itself, because we tend to value security more. It's the same how nowadays a perfect example of a society like that would be the current situation in Iraq, the war-torn country of Iraq. I mean, there's interviews on the internet, for example, of people who were at the Baghdad Square when the Americans invaded, toppling down Saddam's statue, right? And nowadays, their interviews, the same people who toppled down the statue would be like, if I had the chance, I would rebuild it, because what happens now is we've had security, we've had stability, and we gave that up for a flawed sense of freedom and democracy, which we've realized doesn't work. And the idea in general, and that's where I would agree, that democracy is not a perfect system, that democracy is not something that can be implemented everywhere, and democracy is also not something that I think is a goal for us humans. But that's yes. It's not a goal. Yes. See, here's where I think all this, there's a lot of common ground, right? But I feel like cave people, oh man, who knows what fucking politics they had. Then you get to like Rome, oh okay, we got it kind of sorted a little bit. And then you get to like now, and it's like, okay, I think we're starting to get ready for post-democracy. I think we're starting to build the capacity, the post-scarcity world, at least in terms of the first pillar of needs, Sure, there's always going to be things we want, but that basic level of need, we're starting to get really good at meeting. And I think we're ready for the next step. And I think the next goal for us, just like there was a goal for us about getting rid of slavery, which isn't gone everywhere, unfortunately, but, we met that goal. I think there is a goal in the future where all interactions are voluntary. See, what that reminds me of is, I'm not sure, are you familiar with Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the current president of Turkey? Maybe heard of him, maybe not.
No. Erdogan, yes.
Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the current president of Turkey. In 2015, he sparked a crisis in the entire world because people started to call him authoritarian because of a saying that he said. He said, democracy is just like a bus ride. You're riding a bus, and you're riding a bus to a certain destination, and then you get off. So what a lot of people thought of that saying was that a lot of people thought with that saying he was implementing that
he's a dictator and authoritarian at the end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What he meant was that for Turkey, democracy is a system where they're striving for the good of the people, and at some point can drop the system of democracy because they have involved in something else, which is not necessarily something like an authoritarian dictatorship, but something that is similar to a democracy, but where certain values that might hinder us in democracy today might be dropped. And that doesn't necessarily mean that a system which is not a democracy is not as free as a democracy.
Absolutely.
That's where I'm trying to get at.
Have you ever heard of Hans Hermann Hoppe?
Hans Hermann, he sounds German.
He is German or Austrian, I think. And he's got the idea, he's like he's a right anarchist libertarian. He really believes we should have no government of any kind. But he says when you're looking at second best solutions, he thinks monarchy is better than democracy. And he gets all kinds of flack for that because, as you know, there's a lot of reverence for democracy, as you can imagine. But he says a monarchy might be better, and he's got some arguments to support that, right? For instance, and this is, I don't know if this is his, but this is my favorite argument along those lines, is that the king is illegitimate, but you believe democracy is legitimate, right? So what you're willing to do with legitimate power, I think for each person, is more than you're willing to do with illegitimate power. And also what you're willing to accept done by legitimate power is much more than you're willing to accept done by illegitimate power. So you kind of want a king who's a fucking idiot, no one respects him, no one believes he's legitimate. People probably think he's a bastard. He's not even the right guy. Fuck this guy. And then the incentives in that kind of structure might be such that like the people will hold that king to account. The king can't get away with much. Whereas if you have a king in there and everyone reveres him, thinks he's the God-given king, his word is law. It's like, ooh, that might be in the other direction. But with democracy, that's kind of what we feel like about with democracy. You know what I mean? Like we feel like, oh, you won the election. You are God for 4 years. You are whatever you say goes. You just have full control and full power. And so I think that there's some bad incentives maybe, within democracy.
Well, I would argue for the fact that in most functioning democracies, right? So functioning democracy, it's hard to determine how functioning a democracy is.
Sure.
But if we would take an example of countries that are known to be very democratic, so let's take Northern European countries, for example, right? States like Denmark, Finland, Sweden, for example, right?
Yeah.
These countries, so I think in democracy, in most developed democracies, it's not the case that someone, again, is elected and can do whatever the fuck he wants to do, right?
Sure.
Because they're bound by certain guidelines, in most cases being constitutions. It's the same how monarchies after the French Revolution, an example would be when the French Revolution started, a lot of people at that point of the French Revolution didn't necessarily want to abolish democracy, the monarchy itself.
Yes.
What they wanted to do was establish a system like in Great Britain, where the king couldn't do as he pleased,
yes,
but was bound by a constitution. So he wasn't able to accumulate all the wealth and rule by force because he was bound by a constitution.
Yeah.
And so something like that, I think, is something that is that could be applicable in the modern world. I mean, I'm not arguing for a monarchy. I'm arguing because I'm a religious person. I'm a Muslim. And I argue for a caliphate. However, the word caliphate might might sound really badly because of things we think of a caliphate, like ISIS, for example.
Sure. No, but that's just one example. And not only that, it's like it depends on what your ideology of like Islam is on how dangerous or how to perceive a caliphate.
100%. I mean, we've had multiple caliphates in the entire world. We've had Indian caliphates. We've had multiple Arab caliphates.
Yeah.
We've had the biggest Turkish caliphate being the Ottoman Empire back then. And for their time periods, these Islamic empires were incredibly modern, just for the sense that they believed in certain equal rights when it came to freedom of belief, freedom of thought. So I think that that was a case in the Ottoman Empire back then. For example, in the early years of the Ottoman Empire, was that if you're not Muslim, so you're a Christian or a Jew, right, and you live within our empire, you're free to believe whatever you want. You're free to live within our empire. However, since you're not a Muslim, you need to pay a certain tax. So that's the system that was implemented in the Ottoman Empire back then, which sounds very backwards in nowadays, because we think of freedom of thought and freedom of belief and religious freedom being something as a I can live next to somebody else, and we can get along purely on the sense that we believe in different things, right?
Sure.
Which is an ideal system. But back in the day, what happened in other empires, like when the Romans started to convert Germanic tribes in nowadays Germany, was they went into these areas and didn't offer them these systems. They've offered them either you convert to Christianity or we'll slaughter you.
Yeah.
Those are your options.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
And so I think for the age in which these caliphates took place, this system was incredibly modern, while today you would need to apply a different system.
Sure.
Because the Quran itself is applicable to every modern problem we face. Mm-hmm. So you can apply the Quran at every modern problem.
I hate when people say, the Constitution was written 200 years ago, the Bible was 2,000 years ago, as if human nature has changed so significantly in such a short period of time.
Not at all, and that is the point.
Yeah.
So a thing where I have a strong problem with is there is a good amount, because the Quran is written in Old Arabic. It's a dialect of Arabic which is not 100% intelligible to modern day Arabic. Mm-hmm. Which means that the Quran cannot be interpreted in languages that we use nowadays to 100%. Mm-hmm. So what happens is there's a lot of interpretation going on. Mm-hmm. So people read words which might have two meanings, but what they interpret in these words is their personal opinion, right? And that is one issue, because sadly there's not a lot of Muslims in the entire world. I'd say the majority of Muslims on the globe do not have not read the Quran to the full extent and have made up their own mind about it. Yeah. So what they do is, an example would be friends of mine going to the mosque and listening to what our imams or what our preacher says. But what that person is saying is the person's opinion, because he is interpreting certain things into the Quran.
Yeah.
Right? And that is then spread towards other people who tend to ideal or tend to pick up that ideology.
Yeah.
It's the same how ISIS caliphate was objected by every Muslim nation in the entire world, because that said that interpretation of Islam is wrong to us.
Yeah.
But still, because people were not able to read into the Quran in these countries, they still follow these ideologies, right?
Yeah.
But there's obviously also aspects of the demographics and the social economic status of the region back then. But those are side issues. But then again, I think that is a big problem generally with humans, that people tend to, and that's where I think self-determination comes in, that people tend to follow people who they think are right.
Yeah.
And I think that is a concept of how society was built, because we follow people who we thought had the most power, and we automatically thought of them as being right.
Absolutely.
And that is a system that was just brought up by how our societies developed in general, even in the ancient world, right?
Listen, you are smart as shit. You know your shit. It's been an awesome conversation.